So welcome to everybody to today's gathering to learn more about this important ongoing campaign that needs to stay alive and achieve obvious and tangible outcomes. I'm Anne Walker and I'm the National Executive Director of Catholic Religious Australia, and I'll be facilitating today. I'm really grateful to you for being here to welcome our two speakers from the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, otherwise known as ICAN Australia, who'll talk about the state of nuclear weapons around the globe today and the enormous threat they pose for people and the planet, risking catastrophic loss of human life, severe environmental damage, poor human health, and breakdown of national and global security. Our speakers, Jem and Dimity, will outline the important work we all can and we need to do to avert this crisis. But before we begin, we'll start with an acknowledgement of country. Excuse me. We pay our respects to and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us is present and gathers today, and also pay respect to elders, both past, present, and emerging, for the care of our land. And I'll also invite you to join with me in prayer. Pope Francis, at his visit to the atomic bomb hypocenter park in Nagasaki in 2019, prayed these words, the St. Francis Prayer for Peace. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. Amen. This prayer, of course, is so relevant in so many parts of the world today. So before I hand over to Dimity and Jem, just a few housekeeping matters. If you could put your mobiles to silent and mute your mics while you're on Zoom. You've got the option between gallery view and speaker view. And as you know, Sylvia is recording today's events. So in terms of questions and answers, if you could type your questions into the chat box while the speakers are talking to us, and then we'll come back after their sections and I'll put the questions to the speakers. We'll then collate them and have a look at what the common themes might be. So to begin, on his historic visit to the atomic bomb hypocenter park in Nagasaki, Pope Francis spoke about nuclear weapons, stating that peace and international stability are incompatible with attempts to build upon the fear of mutual destruction or the threat of total annihilation. And that the arms race wastes precious resources that could be better used to benefit the integral development of peoples and to protect the natural environment. In a world where millions of children and families live in inhumane conditions, the money that is squandered and the fortunes made through the manufacture, upgrading, maintenance and sale of ever more destructive weapons are an affront crying out to heaven. The Pope called on all of us, individuals, religious communities and civil society, countries that possess nuclear weapons and those that don't, the military and private sectors and international organisations to make a joint and concerted effort to build mutual trust and promote peace between peoples and nations. He urged the Catholic Church to support the principal international legal instruments of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, including the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So CRA are partnered with ICAN and support their important work to promote adherence to and full implementation of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In 2020, ICAN facilitated religious communities across Australia, including CRA, to join forces for the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, to sign an open, interfaith letter to urge the Australian government to join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. To this day, the Australian government has not signed or ratified the treaty. To tell us more about what we can do to continue advocating, I welcome our two speakers from ICAN Australia, Dimity Hawkins and Jem Rommald. I will introduce both of them and we'll have questions about their presentations afterwards. As I said, send those through the chat, please. Dimity has over 2.5 decades of experience in the civil society sector, working as an advocate on issues of nuclear disarmament and broader social, environmental and human rights activism. She's a co-founder of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and is currently a PhD candidate at Swinburne University in Melbourne with a project focusing on nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific. She has a degree in politics and public policy with first-class honours. Dimity was made a member of the Order of Australia in the 2019 Queen's Birthdays Honours for significant service to the global community as an advocate for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Jem is the Australian Director for ICAN, building awareness and pressure for Australia to sign and ratify the UN treaty. She's been a nuclear-free campaigner for a decade, with 6 years' experience producing radio. Jem has degrees in communications and law from the University of Technology, Sydney. We hope that you enjoy the presentations that Dimity and Jem were sharing from us and take forward actions into the next stages. So over to you, Dimity.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's really lovely to be with you all today. It's a real pleasure. Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge that I am speaking this morning from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations here in Naarm in Melbourne. I live and work here on these unceded lands, and I pay my respects to the elders of this place, both past and present. I also pay my particular respects to all First Nation elders and people around the country who may be joining us today, and to each of you as leaders of faith and leaders within your communities. As Anne has said, I am Dimity Hawkins. I'm one of the co-founders of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which is, as you know, a coalition of partner organisations and people across the world working to eliminate the nuclear threat. I was born here in Australia, up in Wurundjeri country, up in central New South Wales, but spent much of my childhood in the Pacific, particularly wonderful years in Fiji, as well as some time in Aotearoa or New Zealand and in Papua New Guinea. A Pacific upbringing taught me a lot of the inequities, but also of a generosity, of peace and conflict, of colonialism, as well as ways to be in the world that are about community care and collective fortunes. It was also where I learned that nuclear powers would use and misuse certain people and places for their own ends. Over 315 nuclear weapons tests took place here in our region, including here in Australia, over a 50-year period. And each of these was conducted by colonial powers, supposed friends, not the enemies that our Cold War upbringings taught us to fear. Growing up in faith, Jesus taught us, blessed are the peacemakers, but the world doesn't always seem to show that. Instead, we see hypermilitarism, we see wars and conflicts, the fallacy of might is right. And Australia has sided with those who proclaim the right to weapons that would destroy this beautiful world. Australia's alliance with the United States has led our political leaders to declare that we rely on US nuclear weapons for our own national security. These are not the actions of a mature sovereign state. This is not the leadership we need in this increasingly fragile and fraught time. I was asked to speak today a little bit about why we launched ICAN in Australia in 2007. It was on a background of war and terror. We were seeing Australia and much of the Western world embroiled in war. We were witnessing terror attacks in retribution for conflicts with inequities and injustice across the globe feeding disaffection. The threat of nuclear weapons use again was increasing. We were seeing the degradation of diplomacy, a failure of disarmament diplomacy in particular. For those of us who've been working on nuclear weapons disarmament for years, often over decades before this, we felt that the time had come for a renewed effort. All of us who were involved were long-term advocates of a nuclear-free world, working from various angles on issues of nuclear disarmament, nuclear-free futures, environmental and human rights responsibilities. As many of you know, nuclear abolition is not a new conversation, but one that has sounded out through decades and across the world. We knew well from close work and generations of teaching how hard it would be to begin a new approach to nuclear disarmament. It is not hard to find teachings on this issue from many sources, including church leaders. In his encyclical in 1963, Pope St. John XXIII stated that nuclear weapons must be banned. In his first encyclical in 1979, Pope St. John Paul II spoke of how modern weapons and means of destruction placed at the service of armed conflicts and wars that are not so much a requirement for defending their just rights and their sovereignty, but rather a form of chauvinism, imperialism, and neo-colonialism of one kind or another. Our current Pope, His Holiness Pope Francis, made his own appeal in 2015 in an encyclical addressing the care of our common home, saying, and I abbreviate here greatly, war always does grave harm to the environment and to the cultural riches of peoples, risks which are magnified when one considers nuclear arms and biological weapons. Politics must pay greater attention to foreseeing new conflicts and addressing the causes that can lead to them. And he asked, what would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it is urgent and necessary to do so? When we began ICAN, we recognized that governments without nuclear weapons cannot actually eliminate them themselves, but we focused on the reality that in an interconnected world, we could bring diplomacy to disarmament. By asserting the needs of global humanity, by centering the voices of those with the lived experience of nuclear weapons use, the survivors and those who did not survive. By making it the business of everyone, we worked to change the political narrative in a fundamental way, to stigmatize and to prohibit those weapons under international law. Over the years since we began here, we've seen the world come together on this issue. ICAN now has over 600 partner organizations in 100 countries around the world. As you said, and Catholic Religious Australia is one of our partners, along with a lot of other faith-based organizations here and around the world. Together, we have advocated for a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and through global effort, this was negotiated at the United Nations in 2017 and opened for signature that same year. And it entered into force in January of this year. We continue to see more and more governments signing and ratifying the ban now too, growing a global accord on the need to end these ultimate weapons of mass destruction. On the very first day of the treaty opening for signature in September 2017, 50 states, including the Holy See, signed. But they went further than that. The Holy See was one of the very first states to ratify this treaty on that same day. It was a remarkable show of support for a new international law. But this is also well in keeping with decades of work from many within the church, which has been central in calling for an end to nuclear weapons. We have a long way to go because the real aim here is to get rid of these weapons altogether. And there are still just over 13,500 of them in the arsenals of 9 nations. But the fact remains, by global effort, there is now international law that renders these weapons illegal. Pope Francis has spoken of the strong link between human rights and nuclear disarmament. For us, the humanitarian effects of these weapons were what changed the tide in this seemingly intractable issue. You can see this in the treaty, recognizing as it does the victims of nuclear use and testing, recognizing the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls and on Indigenous peoples, recognizing the necessity for environmental remediation and victims' assistance. On a visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2019 that you referred to also, Anne, to mark those anniversaries of the bombings and to listen to the Hibakusha, the survivors of those first nuclear weapons used in war, Pope Francis declared that the use of atomic energy for purposes of war is immoral, just as the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral. Again, this is reflected in the new treaty, outlawing not just the use, but the threat of use and the possession of nuclear weapons. The Pope emphasized that a world without nuclear weapons was both possible and necessary, asking political leaders not to forget that these weapons cannot protect us from current threats to national and international security. His Holiness went on to appeal, we need to ponder the catastrophic impact of their deployment, especially from a humanitarian and environmental standpoint, and reject heightening a climate of fear, mistrust, and hostility fomented by nuclear doctrines. I guess in these hard times, it may be tempting to think of bunkering down and to believe that we cannot affect the enormity of global challenges that we face. The pandemic, the climate change, wars, the threat of nuclear weapons. But I am firmly of the belief that any human-made problem has a solution that human genius and some hard graft can find. We simply cannot afford the luxury of despair. Here in Australia especially, many of us have privileges and resources unimaginable in most other places in the world. Those of us with this luck have more power to make a difference than we are led to believe. Peace is not simple. It is hard work. But as people of faith, you know that we cannot be bystanders to the injustice done to others. Honoring the call to be the blessed peacemakers means taking action. Beating swords into plowshares requires the efforts of all of us. It requires us to move beyond our comfort, to speak truth to power, to seek to build communities of care, inclusiveness, and purpose. Putting an end to nuclear weapons is very much a part of this. We cannot abdicate our responsibilities or ignore our place in the world or with our fellow human beings. We cannot live separately from this earth. We are all diminished if we turn away from action in the face of injustice. But for any of us who are needing that extra push to take action, just remember that these weapons are pointed at you, at your family and communities, at everything and everyone that you love in the world, at all you hold sacred. These weapons threaten all of our lives. I know many of you already make the work for peace your business, and ICAN Australia appreciated greatly the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference writing to Prime Minister Scott Morrison to urge Australia to sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons when it came into force this January. As Pope Francis reminds the world, our response to the threat of nuclear weapons must be joint and concerted, inspired by the arduous yet constant effort to build mutual trust and thus surmount the current climate of distrust. So may peace be with you all, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Dimity. We cannot be a bystander. Amongst all of the many things you said really struck me. There are so many justice issues that are relevant for all of us, but it seems to me that this is such an overwhelmingly big one that sometimes it can feel overwhelming. So thank you for what you shared with us, and I'll now invite Jem.
Thanks so much, Anne, and wonderful to be here with you all today. I see a few familiar faces and people that I've had the pleasure to work with in recent years. So thanks so much for being here. It's great to talk with you. I'll just set up my screen. I'm going to share some slides. So can you see a presentation with a giant missile?
We can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So yeah, thanks also to Emma and Sylvia for organising this event today. I'm joining you from Dharawal country, and I'll acknowledge that that's the land that I'm on, and that sovereignty over this country hasn't been given up. And I also want to acknowledge that many people in this Zoom room may have been active against nuclear weapons for decades. So thank you so much for all your efforts, and stick with us, and let's keep going, because the job, as you know, is certainly not done. I'd like to just share with you a little bit of the reminder of why we're here and discussing this, and why, on this fine Monday morning, we're talking about nuclear weapons. So, as Dimity said, nuclear weapons do pose a persistent danger to us, and the risk of their use, whether by accident or on purpose, is growing. The current UN Secretary General has warned, Antonio Guterres, that the world is living in the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. There are still over 13,500 nuclear weapons held by 9 countries, with a couple of thousand able to be launched in a matter of minutes. So it's a very precarious situation. Even without being detonated, nuclear weapons are doing harm. The radioactive contamination and environmental damage caused by the mining and milling of uranium for weapons is happening today. And we must not forget that the legacy of those 315 nuclear tests in the Pacific, including Australia, is ongoing, with intergenerational health impacts and long-term environmental contamination. So, you would hope that nuclear weapons haven't been detonated by accident so far. Hopefully it can stay that way, and we don't see accidents, or we don't see nuclear weapons used in war. But as long as they persist, it's inevitable that at some point they would be used in some way again. So the risk is very high and increasing, especially as command and control systems for the weapons are aging. We've seen more than 30 broken arrows incidents, these are unexpected events involving nuclear weapons that result in the accidental launching, firing, detonating, theft, or loss of the weapon. So to date, there are 6 nuclear weapons that have been lost and never recovered. Early warning systems have been set off by mistake, such as by a training tape in the wrong place, or where various phenomena are mistaken for an incoming nuclear missile, such as a flock of geese, a scientific rocket, or even the reflection of sun of high altitude clouds. The rise of emerging technologies and new offensive cyber warfare capabilities puts these systems at further risk, and we have seen security breaches at nuclear weapons agencies, even as recently as December last year. There is, of course, also the risk that nuclear weapons will be used on purpose. There has been an increase in the number of open nuclear war threats being made in recent years, and we've seen this from the US, from India, and from Pakistan. The doomsday clock, which some of you may be familiar with, it's set by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists as a marker of how close we are to the end of the world. It's sort of a symbolic piece that is determined by a board of many Nobel laureates. And they have the custodianship of this clock, and they reset it every January. It's currently at 100 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it has ever been. And it's in the same position since last year. So many estimate that the risk of nuclear weapons use is higher now than during the Cold War. I see it really as pure luck that nuclear weapons haven't been detonated by accident or in an attack since 1945, but that luck cannot hold. The systems are fallible, the people that control them are fallible, and the leaders that wield them are unpredictable. I just want to mention something about nuclear spending so you have a sense of the numbers, because with every dollar allocated to nuclear weapons, that's a lost opportunity for addressing other things and real human needs. So in 2020, the 9 nuclear armed states spent $72.6 billion on nuclear weapons just in that 1 year. And this is, of course, as the COVID-19 pandemic began to rage across the world. So, it feels criminal, this kind of spending. So it's $137,000 per minute. This money tends to be split between governmental departments and contracts with private companies to build and maintain the weapons. The companies then in turn allocate money to think tanks and lobbyists to lobby government to ensure that policies continue that favour spending on nuclear weapons. One point on think tanks, there were at least 12 major think tanks that research and write on nuclear weapons policy in India, France, the UK and the US that collectively received between $5 and $10 million from nuclear weapons producers in 2020. And in that same year, those companies spent $117 million on lobbying decision makers. And these numbers come from a new ICAN research report called Complicit, which is available on the international ICAN website. So let's get to the good news, which is that we have this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, as Dimity told us about. It came about in 2017, and this puts nuclear weapons on the same legal footing as chemical and biological weapons, landmines and cluster munitions, all of which have been banned by international treaty. So it's a categorical rejection of all activities relating to nuclear weapons, including possession, hosting, development, use and threat of use. It's also illegal to assist or encourage a nation to engage in any of these prohibited activities. The treaty will not eliminate nuclear weapons in the short term, we know that. But it provides a tool to further stigmatise and increase global pressure on the nuclear armed, and that's something that is desperately needed. International law doesn't tend to change things overnight. It does create change incrementally, and obviously we do need the nuclear allied and nuclear armed states to engage to see disarmament happen. But the treaty has shifted the goalposts now, and the nuclear armed states are very clearly on the defensive and they tried to stop this treaty coming about, and they are trying to shut it down and prevent other countries from signing and ratifying. So that's part of how we know that this is a really effective tool and that we are on the right track. As we've seen with the other treaties that prohibit biological and chemical weapons, landmines and cluster bombs, it's really important to have a clear prohibition in place in international law to then progress towards elimination. If you don't have something that's clearly outlawing the weapon, then its status in international law is a little hazy, and the offenders, the nuclear armed states, can use that to their advantage, as they have done for decades now. So it's really great to now have a very clear ban. So the economic, social, political and legal status of nuclear weapons are irrevocably altered by having this treaty, and the landscape, the international legal landscape has changed. And since January, we have this new international standard in force that totally rejects nuclear weapons. That's something that we were told in campaigning for it, that it would be impossible, and now it is reality. A little more on the treaty. I won't dwell here because Dimity already mentioned that it acknowledges the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on First Nations people, and also the disproportionate impact of radiation on women and girls. So that's the first treaty to do that. And the status of it now is 86 signatories and 55 states parties. So that means 55 countries are bound by it and are completely in line with it, and dozens more are progressing towards ratification. And those numbers will only grow. Many countries in their processes to sign and ratify have been delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but we know that many of them are on the right track. So we're looking forward to the first meeting of states parties, which will be a really significant and the first gathering of the community that is a part of the treaty, and that will be in March next year. And that's something that we're pushing for Australia to go to. Obviously, Australia should be there as a state party or a signatory, but failing that, if that didn't happen in time, then they can participate as an observer and actually engage with the content of the treaty. So Australia's position. As Anne said, Australia currently opposes the treaty, hasn't signed yet. Our government boycotted the negotiations and has been, doing what the nuclear armed states want in claiming to need these weapons for our protection. So we're still stuck in the past. We're actually in a really important position here. We're claiming to wholeheartedly support nuclear disarmament. That's what the government, the impression they like to give off, while in reality we're actually doing nothing to push for it. And we're not sitting on the fence, we're on the wrong side of history by saying that these weapons are important for our policy. So this hypocrisy of claiming one thing and doing another, that has definitely received a lot more attention, and that's been exposed and revealed since the treaty was created. So that's been really useful for our work here to educate the public that Australia is not a good guy on this matter. But we are, we're an important ally of the US, so we're in a really good position to push them on this. So one really impactful thing that we can do for nuclear weapons is to end our support for nuclear weapons and joining the treaty. We are not served by a policy that threatens weapons of mass destruction. We should discontinue lending validation to this concept of nuclear deterrence. We are really isolated in the Asia-Pacific region as a non-supporter of the treaty, and our government is just trying to ignore it and avoid it and pretend it doesn't exist. They come up with all sorts of arguments why they don't support it, that don't really hold water, but essentially they're not yet willing to stand apart from the US on this issue because the US has instructed them not to. So we just haven't had the political guts to take a different position, as we have actually already done on other weapon systems. So this has to change. We are already mostly in line with the treaty and all its provisions because of other treaties that we have joined, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, the Rarotonga Treaty. We've also joined all the treaties that prohibit inhumane weapons. So to actually join the treaty and be compliant with it, we do need to end that policy of nuclear deterrence, which we can just stop claiming that that's part of the policy and inform the US that we don't want to be involved in their nuclear weapons program. We're not bound by the ANZUS Treaty to maintain a policy of nuclear deterrence. There's no legal agreement between us and the US. So there aren't legal barriers to us joining the treaty. And we can maintain a military alliance with the US. We have to make sure that we're not collaborating and cooperating on the use or threat of nuclear weapons, including through our surveillance bases like Pine Gap. But this is something that we have disentangled in the past with other weapons. And we have signed other treaties when the US hasn't, and we'll have to do the same again. Sometimes you have to disagree with your ally, especially when it comes to weapons of mass destruction that are now illegal under international law. So who supports this change? Actually, quite a high number of parliamentarians in our federal parliament and around the country. There are hundreds of parliamentarians at the state and territory level and in federal parliament. In the current parliament, there are 89 parliamentarians sitting there who have pledged to work for Australia to sign and ratify this treaty. And the Australian Labor Party has committed in their policy to sign and ratify the treaty in government, and that's a policy that they've had since 2018. There is a parliamentary group called Parliamentary Friends of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and that's a cross-parliamentary group. It's co-chaired by a member of the Nationals Party, a member of the Labor Party, and a member of the Greens Party. And that has about 23 members from across the spectrum who are really interested in this treaty and interested in pursuing it in the parliament. So who else is behind the ban? Well, the vast majority of the public. This is not a controversial issue for most people. When we've done polling, we've seen very clearly that between 71 to 79% of the public want Australia to join this treaty, and it's usually around only 9% or less than 10% that don't want Australia to join this treaty. Councils are coming on board increasingly. So currently 38 local councils have passed a motion and endorsed the ICAN cities appeal to indicate that they want the government to join this treaty. The Australian Local Government Association, which is the peak body for councils at their conference in June, passed a resolution also getting behind the treaty and calling on Australia to join it. The Australian Red Cross, and internationally the Red Cross, is a huge proponent of the treaty, especially as a humanitarian issue. And they say that they're the biggest humanitarian organisation in the world, and there's nothing that they can do to adequately address the use of nuclear weapons. So that's why they're pushing for prevention. So to prevent a nuclear catastrophe, which obviously that needs to be dealing with the problem and eliminating the weapons so that they cannot be used. The Australian Medical Association is a backer of the treaty, along with many other medical organisations, and that work has been led by our partner organisation and actually our founding organisation, the Medical Association for Prevention of War. And as you'll see from this picture, is from a roundtable, interfaith roundtable that we held in Sydney last year. It's hard to imagine all of us, standing so close together in the same room. It makes me nostalgic. But this meeting led to the appeal that Anne mentioned at the start, which 64 faith-based organisations signed on to, calling on Australia to join the treaty. The Australian Council of Trade Unions and a couple dozen unions and trades and labour councils are supporters and are pushing also for Australia to join the treaty. Our partner organisations, and we've had specific appeals in the past also, with hundreds of prominent Australians signing on, and another appeal with more than 50 international lawyers calling for the end of the policy of nuclear deterrence. So many supporters, many people pushing for this change. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to keep going, and we want to get to the point where it's the movement for Australia to join this treaty is undeniable and has to be responded to. So we're pushing for Australia to join this treaty. The government is stuck in its old ways, and it's really political will and political inertia that is getting in the way now. So we require a little political courage, and we require as many people as possible from all corners of Australian society to be pushing for this, and to saying that you won't accept anything less than joining this treaty. So it's a movement that is making history, and a big part of that will be Australia's ratification of the treaty. And we see this as something that is eminently doable. This is something that can be done. It's inevitable that it will be done, and we just want to get it done as soon as possible. So, we of course invite you to get involved in any way that you can. One way would be to learn more about it and to become, something that we call a nuclear weapon ban advocate. And that could involve raising this with your council, with your councillors, or with your parliamentary representatives, whether that's at the state, territory or federal level. We have plenty of resources to share, and we can give advice or provide background on our conversations with various parliamentarians or councils. And I'm sure that several of you in this call have already been doing that. So thank you so much. Even if your representatives are supportive, there is more that we need them to do. So, one very current demand is that Australia attends this first meeting of states parties that I mentioned in March next year, and also for Labor that they send a representative to participate in that as well, which is consistent with their policy to join the treaty. I just want to mention our Quit Nukes campaign, which is about Australian superannuation funds and encouraging them to divest from investments in nuclear arms producers. It's quite possible that your super fund is invested in nuclear weapons. Most Australian super funds are. So please get involved in that, and at least put a query to your super fund. What is their position on nuclear weapons, and can they verify what their investments are? And of course, if all of this sounds too hard, then please help us do the work by contributing to the campaign. And we really value our benefactors, who are our regular donors. even $10 a month is really an excellent way to help us plan and budget. We do a lot with a little. And here are just some contacts for me and for ICAN Australia if you do want to follow up after this session. And if you're interested in doing any kind of advocacy on the treaty, we really welcome that. And that's all from me. Thank you so much for your attention today.
Thank you, Jem. The start of your talk about the numbers, the money is just shocking, really. It's just amazing. But I suppose what struck me again when I think of the work of ICAN is that I can imagine when the founders sat around, Dimity, of what can we do here? Can we have a UN treaty that we're getting so many countries to sign up to? It must have seemed a pipe dream. And yet you've achieved so much. It's really significant. So thank you for the work that you've done and continue to do. I see the emails across the world of what activity is happening. But the important point, an important point of today is Jem's call at the end to what can we do? What can we do? What do we have to do to support this action? So thank you. Just a few questions, bearing in mind the time that I've received. And I'll let Dimity and Jem work out who responds to them across the way. It's obviously easier when you're next to each other and can turn to each other, but I'm sure you can work that out. One of the questions is, what's the position of our neighbours in the Asia Pacific region towards the treaty?
I'll have a go at that one. Throughout the Pacific, it's been quite remarkable. In particular, there's 9 Pacific Island states who have signed and ratified the treaty, and New Zealand as well. Aotearoa, New Zealand has also signed and ratified. So of the first 50 states that we needed to be able to enter into force this treaty, 10 of them were from our region, from the Pacific region alone. Then in addition to that, we have a large number of Asian states who are also signed and ratified and are increasing, those numbers are increasing as we go along. So we're seeing some really big regional support for this treaty. And there's, as I said at the beginning of my talk, there's a good reason for that. We've also seen a lot of harm done here through nuclear weapons testing. So that's why we're seeing this kind of response, I believe, throughout the Pacific. And if you listen to the Pacific leaders, particularly talking about this, they cite the harms that were done through nuclear testing as one of the reasons why they're calling for an end to nuclear weapons. So yeah, there's a lot of support regionally. And we are really outliers in this regard, I think.
Thank you, Dimity. Yes, those nuclear testing has certainly had an impact on the region. A question I've received by text is a query about the fact that nuclear weapons activity disproportionately impacts Indigenous people, women and girls. If you could unpack that a little bit for us, please.
Jem, do you want to do that?
I'll start off and then please jump in. I think part of that is about the history of nuclear testing and whose lands nuclear weapons have been tested on and whose homes have been considered dispensable. So we've seen that very clearly in Australia with nuclear weapons being tested on Aboriginal land and Aboriginal people being, some being notified in very inadequate efforts and people being literally taken off their land and moved to missions or people who've been forced to migrate to other parts of the country and who had no say in whether their lands would be used for nuclear weapons testing. And then those lands being experimented on and poisoned and the impacts of that still being felt today. And of course, then the fallout from those tests travelling far and wide, affecting local populations intensely, but also affecting people all over the country. There were sensors picking up radiation in northern Queensland when there were nuclear tests done in South Australia. So many people on this call could probably speak to some of the details, but it's a really harrowing history of the impacts of nuclear weapons testing all over the world. And, you know, the calls for justice have not been answered. And we're seeing, you know, the next generation and the next generation after that, who are also still impacted by those weapons, who are now leading the charge. And part of that is using this treaty to seek justice and to seek some form of redress. So part of the treaty does look at, does require states to address impacted environments and to seek to support survivors and people who have been impacted by nuclear weapons. And so this is really positive, and it's hasn't happened before in this space, where people who have been impacted by nuclear weapons do now have a tool to use to seek some change and some justice for what's happened.
I'd just add to that, if I may, and you asked about the disproportionate impact on women and girls in particular. That's actually through the result of ionizing radiation. There's many scientific studies that have proven that there is a disproportionate impact on women and girls as a result of the ionizing radiation from the use of these weapons, whether it's through war or through testing, of which there's been over 2,000 tests done around the world of nuclear weapons. So there's a lot of growing scientific evidence around the ionizing radiation. And so that was included in the treaty after much scientific inquiry on behalf of the governments who were making those humanitarian impact statements.
Thank you both. Another question, which is possibly an extension. China is expected to continue building up its arsenal of nuclear weapons despite NATO's appeal for it to sign up to international arms controls. What can the international community do about this?
Well, I'll start with that one. Yes, China, there are real concerns at the moment. There's a lot of international security concerns at the moment, and certainly China's nuclear weapons are a really big concern. But there's a sort of inequity that gets put about around these things. And part of that is that part of that is that America and the Russians have about 95% of the world's nuclear weapons and have had since the beginning. So it's very problematic to just be looking at one state and their nuclear weapons. Any nuclear weapons are a problem, of course, but there is a disproportionate responsibility here on those states which own the majority of the nuclear weapons to actually make the moves to stigmatize and to outlaw these weapons. We're not seeing that from any of those major nuclear weapon states. There's 9 of them at the moment. 2 of them have 95% of those weapons. So we should be asking that question of all nuclear weapon states, certainly. That said, of course, there are, grave concerns about international security, and there's grave concerns within our region about these sorts of posturing and so forth. All the more reason to focus on getting rid of these weapons once and for all. We just don't have the time to be playing around with this sort of thing. This threat, this sword of Damocles hanging over our heads has got to stop. So I would say that. I don't know, Jen might have something to add as well.
Yeah, I'll just only add briefly that China is actually, I think, currently the only nuclear arms state that has a policy of no first use. So it wouldn't be the first to use nuclear weapons. It would only respond with nuclear weapons if it were first attacked by nuclear weapons. So, all of the other nuclear arms states should adopt a similar policy. If all of them are saying, well, I won't attack you first, then that de-escalates the tension and the threat. And then that could be an important step towards actually seeing disarmament happen. Obviously, it's not enough, because a no first use policy implies that a second use is okay, or a third use or a fourth use. And of course, we would say that, never using nuclear weapons, you should just disarm. But that is just an interesting point that differentiates China, which has about 300 nuclear weapons, from other states like the US and Russia, who have more than 5,000 each.
Jem, thanks for that. And Dimity, is there much conversation around a first use policy?
No, not a lot of conversation. There has been over different periods of time. There's been conversations around that. I think we are beyond that. I think we need to be actually pushing for getting rid of the weapons altogether. They're now banned under international law. They're now illegal under international law. And I think that although I do support the calls for no first use policy, I don't want anything to stymie the actual progress to get rid of these weapons altogether. They shouldn't be there. As long as they exist, they are at risk of being used. So we should just get rid of them.
So you think that would be a distraction to focus on that?
To focus on that would be a distraction for us. I know that some states are looking at those sorts of things. So the United States there's campaigners within the United States who are looking at those sorts of things, and others that are incremental approaches. And I understand that from the enormity of the challenges they face. But I think our message is clear on this one. Just get rid of them.
Thank you. And then I just received another question from that. What do we do with them when we get rid of them? I thought it was a good question when I just received it.
Yeah, I do like that question, because it is a reminder that nuclear weapons are objects that were built and that every single one of them can be taken apart. And at some points, I like to fantasize about having a job dismantling nuclear weapons, and just instead of doing all of this sort of policy and campaigning, just actually getting the angle grinders out and dismantling nuclear weapons. But I'm sure it's highly technical, and I'm not at all qualified for that kind of work. But essentially, and thousands of nuclear weapons have been dismantled over the years, and at the height of the Cold War, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons in total. So we have seen a reduction. Unfortunately, we've seen an increase in the power and the capacity for destruction of the nuclear weapons that exist. So we can't sort of rest on our laurels and expect that they'll just gradually get to zero without significant pressure. But there have been, various initiatives, like in some cases, nuclear weapons are dismantled, and then their ingredients have been used for nuclear power. So the uranium and plutonium and various elements have then been down mixed into lower concentrations so that they can be used for other purposes. But my preference would be really that the pits are just put aside and stored, of which that's another way that nuclear weapons are dealt with, is all of the weaponry is taken apart, the warheads are taken off, and the radioactive parts, or the pits, are they have to be stored essentially for thousands of years, into time long beyond when humans will exist. That's how long they remain dangerous for. So it's radioactive waste that then has to be taken care of and put aside.
Thank you, Jem, and thanks, Sylvia, for that question. Just in view of the time, the last question I've got is, what makes this treaty different from other nuclear arms treaties?
Well, many things. One of the really important things is that this is negotiated by those states that don't have the weapons. A lot of the existing infrastructure of nuclear disarmament was put in place by those states, and particularly advocated by those states that had the weapons. So, for example, you see the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that came into force in 1970. You see that one was about cementing the control of nuclear weapons by those 5 nuclear weapon states, the first 5 nuclear weapon states, and then excluding those weapons from all of the other states who would sign on. And that kind of inequity that was existing within those sort of treaties that were set up internationally was part of the problem. They reinforced a kind of control over those kind of inequities between them. That treaty also had a commitment to disarmament. It had a commitment to eliminating nuclear weapons. But 50 years on, we've still not seen that happen. So this treaty has many aspects which make it quite unique in the international disarmament world. The biggest one for me, I think, is the humanitarian aspect that's been brought into this. So the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons were central to the ways in which we talked and worked collectively around the world to get rid of these nuclear weapons by prohibiting them in this treaty. So you see this sort of humanitarian impact framework at work in other treaties, such as the Landmines Treaty, and that was very much a framework that we were interested in when we were looking at this, when we were first starting this process. But that humanitarian aspect is really key to bring together not just the mechanics of disarmament and disarmament diplomacy, but as well centering the humanitarian impacts of these weapons, which, as you see, is written throughout the preamble in particular, but also Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty, which look at environmental remediation and victims assistance. These things are really new to the nuclear disarmament mechanisms that we have, and it's made all the more strong because of it as well.
Thank you, Dimity. So that brings us to the end of our time together today. Thank you to all of you who attended, and to those of you who I know have been active in this area for many years, as Jem mentioned. There were a photo of a few of you were in that photo that Jem showed us the other day when we met last year. But thank you especially to Dimity and Jem for giving us an hour of your time now, and of course your preparation, your time and your expertise, but also thank you for the action, thinking, strategic planning that you do to try and affect this change for the world. It's a big task, so thank you that you're doing it for us. Today's been recorded by Sylvia, so a link to the recording will be made available to you in a few days' time by email, and you can share that with others who you think it would be helpful, and we want to spread the message. I hope today has inspired us all to take up some of the actions that Jem outlined for us in the campaign to abolish nuclear weapons for good. Thank you to my team, Sylvia and Emma, as usual, but thank you to each of you, and God bless, stay safe. Thank you all.